Looking at the question that this House believes lockdown was a mistake, first of all, we have to ask, which lockdown are we talking about? We were, I think all of us, invited to participate in this debate back in November, when the UK had embarked on the second lockdown that had previously been regarded as entirely unthinkable. Since then, we've had the joy of tears and now a third lockdown as well. There is clear evidence that infections peaked in England before the first lockdown was announced, probably due to hand washing and distancing, but without school closures having been announced at that point, or closing all hospitality. It also appears from Professor Tim Spector's Zoe app data that infections had peaked in London, at least, before the current lockdown 3 was introduced. As The Lancet, that great medical journal, reported on the 23rd of December, looking at the second lockdown, it remains unclear how effective the tiered restrictions were in reducing transmission and what additional reduction in transmission might have been accomplished by the second lockdown. So we can see the efficacy of lockdowns is unclear. Certainly, rates had started to fall before schools were closed earlier this month, or indeed last March. In my constituency in Greater Manchester, tough new restrictions were put in place at the end of last July, bridging the gap between lockdown 1 and regional tiers. In July, rates locally were in the region of 30 to 40 per 100,000 people. At the end of the summer, the rates in my borough had risen to between 200 and 300. Not a great advertisement for the efficacy of restrictions or lockdowns. So we know that rates of transmission can fall without lockdown and can rise whilst restrictions are in place. While some degree of restriction does, I'm sure, impact transmission, it remains, as The Lancet reports, unclear whether lockdown has any particular beneficial impact. Something that was echoed by SAGE's own paper published last autumn on what they call non-pharmaceutical interventions, essentially the closure of restaurants and bars and hospitality venues, where they had been made COVID secure with huge effort and expense over the summer. And SAGE reported that there was no strong evidence that any of these so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions would have any significant effect. And yet, those restrictions were duly put in place. Then we have the plethora of arbitrary and senseless lockdowns that even ministers don't seek to defend. In lockdown 1, why could you leave your house to walk or to run or to cycle, but not to do all three? If obesity is a risk factor, why seek to limit exercise? Surely if you were going to run and walk and cycle on your own, all in the course of the same day, that would have been a beneficial thing to do. Why has a round of golf with a member of your own household, which was considered dangerous last April, safe in lockdown 2, and now once again rendered an illegal activity? Why today should it be a criminal offence to go out for a walk alone twice in the same day? In what sane world would it be against the law to sit on a quiet riverbank with a fishing rod a quarter of a mile away from the nearest human being? The explanation that ministers offer when I challenge them on this in the House of Commons is that if we, and I paraphrase, but I think it's pretty close to a quote, if we let people exercise those freedoms, then they might expect to exercise some others too. A definition of a policy that seeks to infantilize the British people. So we have evidence that infection falls without lockdown. It is unclear whether lockdown does more than lesser restrictions can achieve. Some restrictions are introduced when SAGE says there is no evidence for them, and some are introduced which even the ministers responsible for them will not even try to defend. But we've got to ask ourselves too, what harm is being done with such a flimsy evidential base. Not just the 800,000 people who have been thrown out of work since March, or the hundreds of thousands who may have no job to return to when furlough comes to an end. Not just the adults being treated for anxiety or the growing number who are taking their own lives, but the hideous toll on children and young people too, with half of 16 to 25-year-olds reporting deteriorating mental health, a threefold increase in the reporting of eating disorders, and the NSPCC reporting a 43% increase in referrals for child abuse. Ladies and gentlemen, social interaction through face-to-face contact for human beings is not a luxury. It is essential for healthy development from infancy through adolescence. As Professor Russell Viner, President of the Royal College of Paediatrics, put it, when you close schools, we close their lives, not to benefit them, but to benefit the rest of society. Conscious of time, Mr. President, I want to close with what I believe is my most fundamental and important point. I want to ask whether government has any right to remove fundamental human rights from innocent people who are carrying no infection, depriving them of the right to see children or grandchildren, keeping people away from vulnerable elderly parents with dementia in care homes, ending the right of free association or indeed of peaceful protest. And the lowest point of all, perhaps, was earlier last year when Matt Hancock started telling people with whom they were allowed to have sex. We should be responsible. We should recognize our responsibility to look after our own health and to protect other people. But we also have to recognize the critical importance of these fundamental rights. And if we say that government has the right to take them away, we should then ask, but for how long? For 3 weeks might have been one thing. For a year is quite another. We should do what we can to fight this terrible virus. But if we have lost our freedoms and all that makes life worth living, then lockdown has been a mistake, not just once, but 3 times. Thank you.